We've been going through the minor prophets Sunday night. Actually, about to get done with that. Well, a couple more. And tonight we're going to talk about Zephaniah, which is kind of an interesting prophet. He came into power at a really bad time in the history of Judah, a time when we'd had some really evil kings. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he was one of the most wicked kings in all of Judah. And after him followed Ammon, and Ammon was actually murdered. And a lot of people think he was murdered because they wanted to get away from the Assyrians, so he was actually murdered. And because he was murdered, it should have been his group that took over, Ammon's group. But there were people that were still kind of loyal to God, and they killed all them off, and we wound up setting Hosea on the throne. And the interesting thing about Hosea is that Hosea was only 8 years old when he became king. That's a little hard to believe, isn't it? I was thinking when I was doing that, I thought, Ridge is 6, so like 2 years from now, Ridge would be king of Judah. That would be kind of interesting, wouldn't it? So anyway, he was only 8 years old when he became king. But Hosea turned out to be a really good king. But before Hosea took over, like I say, Ammon was terrible. Manasseh was terrible. Very evil, vile kings that aligned themselves to the Assyrians. And so when Zephaniah started to prophesy on this, he said, basically, God was going to destroy Judah because they were so evil. He said, woe to her rebellious and defiled, the tyrannical city. She heeded no voice, she accepted no instruction, she did not trust in the Lord, she did not draw near to her God. Her princes within her are roaring lions, her judges are wolves at evening, they leave nothing for the morning. Her prophets are reckless, treacherous men. Her priests have profaned the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. The Lord is righteous within her. He will do no injustice. Every morning he brings his just to light. He does not fail, but the unjust knows no shame. Zephaniah was really critical, and if you read Zephaniah, the first chapter, he basically said, the day of the Lord's coming, and he's just going to destroy y'all because he's had it with you. And that was Judah and all the nations around it. So it wasn't just these other nations. It was like Judah, which is God's, that's where Jerusalem is. And he said, I'm going to destroy you. But thankfully, Hosea comes along. And Hosea is a really good king. He's just a boy, only 8 years old. But he has good people around him. Maybe the story of Hosea is that good people around you can make you a great person. I don't know for sure. But Hosea was really young, but he was really good. And he turned back to the Lord. And it's hard to believe how far Judah had fallen. In Jerusalem, you think about Israel being God's people, and Israel knows, and the temple's there, and the law's there, and the priests are there, and the sacrifices there, and Jerusalem's God's city, right? Zion. And you think that's how it should be. But by the time Hosea became king, they didn't even know where the book of the law was. The temple was strewn with pagan worship. There was nothing left of God there. He was gone. It's hard to imagine in my mind how far Judah had drifted away from God when Hosea actually stepped in to become king. In 2 Chronicles, it says Hosea was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. He did right in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father David, and did not turn aside to the right or to the left. For in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still a youth, he began to seek the God of his father David, and in the 12th year he began to purge Judah. So he was 8 years old, right? And so when he was 16, right? When he was 16, he began to seek the God of his father David, right? And in the 12th year, right? So when he was 20, in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem with the high places, the Asherim, the carved images, and the molten images. They tore down the altars of the Baals in his presence, and the incense altars that were high above them he chopped down. Also the Asherim and carved images and molten images he broke in pieces and ground to powder, thus scattered it on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He burned the bones of the priests on their altars and purged Judah and Jerusalem in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, Simeon, even as far as Naphtali and their surrounding ruins. He also tore down the altars and beat the Asherim and carved images into powder and chopped down all the incense altars throughout the land of Israel. Then he returned to Jerusalem. So when this guy is 20 years old, when he's 16 years old, he turns and begins to follow God. 16 years old. So that's pretty impressive. And at 20, he goes and he does all these things at 20 years old. He tears down all these altars. He destroys them. He kills these prophets that are false. He does all these things. And you think, man, he's really on track. You know, Hosea is really doing good things. But it gets kind of interesting. Well, it did. What happened to my deal? There we go. In 2 Kings, because he starts to clean the temple up, to pull the altars out of the temple and the molten images out of the temple. And Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan the scribe, I found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. That verse just astounds me. How do you lose it, right? How do you lose God's law in God's house? But that's how far they had fallen away. They didn't even have it anymore. They didn't even know what it was. Hosea is king. He's doing all these things for God. He doesn't even have the instruction book, right? He doesn't even know what God really wants at all. He's just doing what his fathers did. And it's just an astounding idea to me, you know, how you could lose God's law in God's house. But that's what happened. They found the book. Wow, we found Deuteronomy in the temple. How do you lose Deuteronomy in the temple? Just astounds me, right? And he says, so he brought it and they read it, and the king, it was a revelation to him. This is what we're supposed to do. This is how we're supposed to ask. He says, your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it into the hand of the workmen who have oversight. Shaphan the scribe told the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. Shaphan read it in the presence of the king, and when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. You know, he realized how far away they had drifted from God because they didn't even have his word. They didn't even have his law. And those are the days of Zephaniah. And so when you read Zephaniah at the first of it, and he says, I'm going to destroy Judah. I'm going to tear it down. I'm going to utterly destroy you. I'm going to basically wipe you from the face of the earth. And you're like, how can God say that about Jerusalem? How can God say that about Israel? But this is why. Because they had totally turned, totally forgot who God was, totally lost sight of what was going on. And so Zephaniah gives them this, he gives them this property, this deal. But they go to Huldah, this prophetess, and they consult her. Hosea consults her. And he sends people to her to say, what's going to happen? You know, how's this going to play out? So they go to Huldah, this prophetess, and he says, I will bring evil on this place and its inhabitants, even all the words of the book which the king of Judah has read. So in other words, God's saying, I'm still going to bring judgment because they haven't done what's in that book, the book you read. You haven't done that. It says, because they have forsaken me and have burned incense to other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the work of their hands. Therefore my wrath burns against this place, and it shall not be quenched. But to the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, thus shall you say to him, thus says the Lord God of Israel, regarding the words which you heard. Because your heart was tender, and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, as they should become a desolation and a curse. And you have torn your clothes and wept before me. I truly have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will gather you to your fathers. You will be gathered to your grave in peace. And your eyes will not see all the evil which I will bring on this place. So they brought back word to the king. So Zephaniah prophesies this horrible judgment on Judah. I'm going to wipe you out. But then Hosea comes along. And Hosea is 8 years old. Hosea takes the throne. Hosea does all these wonderful things. He basically turns Israel back to God. He cleans out the temple. He rebuilds the temple. He finds the books of the law. He weeps before the Lord. He turns back to God with all his heart. And God says, you know, I'm still not going to forgive them for all that they've done, but I'm going to put off a little while. And so Zephaniah, at the end of Zephaniah, there's some hope for them because of this one guy, because of this king. He says, I will give the people purified lips, that all of them will call on the name of the Lord, to serve him shoulder to shoulder. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshipers, my dispersed ones, will bring my offerings. And that day you will feel no shame because of your deeds by which you rebelled against me. For then I will remove them from your midst, your proud, exulting ones, and I will never again be haughty. You will never again be haughty on my holy mountain, but I will leave among you a humble and lowly people, and they will take refuge in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel will do no wrong and tell no lies, nor will a deceitful tongue be found in their mouths, for they will feed and lie down with no one to make them tremble. You know, that's us. I mean, I really believe that's what Zephaniah is saying. He says, eventually Israel's going to be destroyed. I'm going to tear it down. I'm going to scatter them. But he says, But he says, I'm going to bring them back even from beyond Ethiopia, even those who aren't Israel. I'm going to bring them back, and they're going to worship me. They're not going to be afraid, and they're going to feed, and they're going to lie down with no one to make them tremble. This idea that that's us. You know, it's just an interesting part of history, how a nation turns away from God like Israel did, how they forget who God was, forget what God's about. And yet there's one man that comes back, isn't there? One man that comes back, Hosea, a kid, a boy, 8 years old, that comes to take the throne. And God says, you know what? I'm going to wait a while. I'm going to wait a while because I've heard you. I know you. One person can make a difference. I don't know. There's so many lessons in this, right? I think there's a lesson that young people can make a huge difference, right? I think we disregard that sometimes. We think, oh, well, they're too young. Well, you know what? Hosea was 16 years old when he turned his heart to the Lord and changed and started his journey. He was 20 years old when he did all those great things. That's pretty young, right? 8 years old when he took the throne. 8. That's pretty young, right? So I think there's a lesson that young people can make a huge difference. I also think there's a lesson that God can relent, that God can say, you know what? I'll wait a while. I'll take it back. I hear you. But there's a lesson that God hears us, isn't it? God hears Hosea. God heard him wept, saw him tear his clothes, knew that he turned back to him. There's so many lessons in this book. But yet maybe the overall lesson is that God's still going to punish those who are guilty. Maybe that's the lesson of this. I'm not going to let it go. Even though Hosea was good and I'm going to let it go a while, guess what? In the end, I'm still going to do what I was going to do. I'm still going to take vengeance against those people who weren't worthy or weren't holy. But maybe the lesson of this is that in the end, it's all going to be all right. God's going to call people back, and it's all going to be good, and God's going to love us, and that's who we are, and that it's all going to turn out all right in the end. I don't know. There's a lot of lessons here. A lot of lessons here. He prophesied at a really weird time in the history of Israel. The reason Hosea was able to do what Hosea did was because the Assyrians were losing their power. But at the same time the Assyrians were losing their power, I'll give you a little history, the Egyptians were coming up. Nebo, who eventually will kill Hosea in battle. The Egyptians are coming up, but it's also setting the stage for the Babylonians to take over from the Assyrians. That's what's happening now. The Babylonians are starting to take over the Assyrians. The Egyptians are coming up. This is all setting the stage for what eventually will be the destruction of Jerusalem. The Babylonians will destroy Jerusalem. Judah, they'll be waiting for the Egyptians to come up and save them. Egypt's not going to come. The Babylonians are going to conquer them. It's all setting the stage for what's going to happen. But because of Hosea, because of Zephaniah, because of this point in history, God said, you know what? I'm going to wait a while. I'm going to wait a while because you're a good king. You're a good man, and I hear what you're saying. I don't know. I hope it's got a lesson for you. If we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand and sing.